Hey everyone, welcome to Hindsight, the show that explores how yesterday's decisions shape today's reality. I'm Rowan Thompson, and with me, as always, is my brilliant co host, Alex Chen.
Hi, everyone. I'm really looking forward to today's topic. I've been reading up on it and wow, just wow.
You know, Alex, what if I told you that one of the most expensive covert operations in CIA history ended up helping create the very threats it now fights?
Wait, are you talking about what happened in Afghanistan during the 1980s?
Exactly. We're diving into a $20 billion CIA operation that changed everything. And that's just the beginning of our story.
I think what fascinates me most is how these decisions from decades ago are still affecting us today. It's like pulling on one thread and watching an entire tapestry unravel.
That's such a good way to put it. Today, we're exploring how American foreign policy decisions, starting with the Soviet-Afghan War, have shaped modern jihad in ways nobody could have predicted.
And we're talking about everything from Al Qaeda to ISIS to how social media is changing the game now, right?
Absolutely. It's a complex story of unintended consequences, strategic decisions, and how they've created ripple effects we're still dealing with in 2025.
I can tell this is going to be quite a journey.
Let me take you back to 1979. The Soviets had just invaded Afghanistan, and the CIA saw an opportunity they couldn't resist. They called it Operation Cyclone, and at the time, it was the most expensive covert operation they'd ever undertaken.
$20 billion, right? That's an astronomical amount of money for that time period.
Exactly, and what's fascinating is how they structured it. The CIA didn't just dump weapons into Afghanistan. They created this incredibly complex supply chain, working through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI.
Hmm. So they were basically using Pakistan as a middleman?
More like a partner, but yes. The ISI would handle the direct contact with the Afghan fighters called the Mujahideen. They'd distribute weapons, coordinate training, even decide which groups got what resources.
I've always wondered, what kind of weapons are we talking about here?
Well, it started with basic Soviet-style weapons, AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades. But by 1986, the game completely changed when they introduced Stinger missiles.
Oh, wow. Those are the shoulder-fired missiles that can take down aircraft, aren't they?
Exactly, and they were incredibly effective. The Soviets lost about 270 aircraft to these missiles. But here's where it gets really interesting. The CIA wasn't just supplying weapons. They were creating an entire infrastructure.
What do you mean by infrastructure?
Think about it like building a university for guerrilla warfare. They established training camps along the Afghan-Pakistan border. They brought in military experts to teach everything from basic weapon handling to advanced guerrilla tactics.
So we weren't just arming these fighters, we were teaching them how to be more effective warriors.
And not just that. The CIA also helped create these vast networks of fighters. They connected different groups, facilitated cooperation, even helped establish supply routes that crossed multiple countries.
That sounds like it could have some serious long-term implications.
It absolutely did. You see, while Operation Cyclone was incredibly successful in its primary goal, forcing the Soviets out of Afghanistan, it also created something else. A whole generation of well-trained, battle-hardened fighters with access to sophisticated weapons and established networks.
And I'm guessing these weren't the kind of networks that just disappeared when the Soviets left.
Not at all. In fact, these networks became the foundation for something much bigger. But there's another fascinating aspect to this that often gets overlooked. The operation didn't just create military networks, it created financial ones too.
Financial networks? How so?
The CIA needed ways to fund all of this without direct ties back to the US, so they worked with various banks and financial institutions, creating complex money laundering systems. Some of these same systems would later be used to finance, well, activities that weren't exactly in America's best interests.
That's incredible. It's like we built this entire parallel infrastructure that ended up being used against us.
Exactly. And here's something that really shows the scale of what we're talking about. By the time Operation Cyclone ended, the CIA had helped transport over 65,000 tons of weapons and ammunition to Pakistan.
65,000 tons? That's hard to even visualize.
It is, and remember, every single piece of that hardware needed to be tracked, distributed, and taught how to use. The ISI had basically become experts at running this kind of operation.
So we weren't just creating fighters, we were creating entire systems for moving weapons, money, and people around the region.
And those systems didn't just disappear when the Soviets left Afghanistan, they evolved. But that's actually leading us into our next chapter of this story. You know, while all this was happening in Afghanistan, there was another story unfolding, one that would change everything. And it centers around a young Saudi from a wealthy family who joined the Afghan cause.
You're talking about Osama bin Laden, aren't you?
Exactly. In 1979, the same year the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, bin Laden was just a 22-year-old university student. He was studying economics and business administration in Jeddah,
That's not exactly the background you'd expect for someone who'd become, well, you know.
right? And here's something fascinating. When he first went to Afghanistan in 1984, he wasn't even going as a fighter. He was basically acting as a fundraiser, using his family connections to channel money and resources to the Mujahideen.
Wait, so he started more as a businessman than a warrior?
Precisely. But there was someone else who really shaped his path, a Palestinian scholar named Abdullah Azzam. Azzam was this charismatic figure who'd been teaching at a university in Saudi Arabia.
What made Azam so influential?
He had this unique ability to blend religious ideology with practical organization. Together with bin Laden, he established what they called the Services Bureau, Maktab al-Khidamat in Arabic. It was like a welcome center for foreign fighters coming to join the Afghan Jihad.
So it was kind of like a recruitment center?
More than that, it was a complete support network. They'd handle everything, travel arrangements, training coordination, even taking care of fighters' families. But here's where things get really interesting. By 1988, bin Laden started thinking bigger.
Is this when Al Qaeda was formed?
Yes, but it wasn't what most people think. The original idea was actually pretty straightforward. They wanted to keep the network of fighters together after the Soviets left Afghanistan.
So it wasn't initially aimed at America?
Not at all. The real turning point came in 1990 with the Gulf War. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, bin Laden actually offered to defend Saudi Arabia using his network of experienced fighters.
But the Saudis turned him down, right?
They did. Instead, they invited in American troops. Now, imagine how that felt, having non-Muslim troops stationed in the land of Islam's two holiest sites. For bin Laden, this was absolutely unacceptable.
So this is when everything really started to shift?
Exactly. It's fascinating how this one decision, allowing U.S. troops to be based in Saudi Arabia, became such a powerful recruitment tool. Bin Laden started seeing America not just as a former ally, but as an occupying force in the Muslim world.
It's incredible how these things connect. The same networks and resources that were built up fighting the Soviets
Were now being turned against the United States, and they had all the tools they needed, the training, the networks, the financial systems. Everything the CIA had helped create was now being repurposed.
that must have been a huge wake-up call for U.S. intelligence.
You'd think so, but here's the thing. Al-Qaeda's transformation happened so gradually that many people didn't see it coming. By 1996, when bin Laden declared war on America, the organization had already evolved into something completely different from its original form.
It's like watching a slow-motion train wreck. You can see all the pieces coming together but can't stop it.
That's a perfect way to put it. And what makes it even more complex is that all of this was happening while the Middle East was going through massive changes. The Gulf War had reshuffled regional alliances, and new technologies were making it easier for these groups to coordinate and spread their message.
So we basically helped create the perfect storm.
And that storm was just beginning to gather. The next phase would introduce elements that nobody could have predicted. Now we come to a pivotal moment that changed everything, September 11th, 2001. The response to those attacks would become the most expensive military and intelligence operation in American history.
$6.4 trillion, right? That's such a massive number, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
It really is. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire GDP of every country except China and the United States. And what's fascinating is how that money was spent.
I'm guessing a lot went into military operations?
Yes, but it was so much broader than that. The US created this massive new security infrastructure. Think about it. Before 9/11, most Americans had never heard of the Department of Homeland Security. Now it's one of the largest federal agencies.
And we got the Patriot Act, enhanced security at airports. It really changed everyday life, didn't it?
Absolutely. But here's where it gets really interesting. All this spending and these new security measures might have actually contributed to creating more of the very things they were trying to prevent.
What do you mean exactly?
Well, take Iraq, for example. The 2003 invasion completely destabilized the region. When we disbanded the Iraqi army, we suddenly had hundreds of thousands of trained military personnel with no jobs and a lot of resentment.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that. So these were people who already knew how to fight.
Exactly. And many of them would later join groups like ISIS, but there's another fascinating aspect to this. The role of private military contractors.
You mean like mercenaries?
Well, they prefer the term security contractors, but yes, at one point there were more contractors in Iraq than actual U.S. military personnel, and they were expensive, some of them making up to $1,000 per day.
Per day? That's incredible.
And here's something that really shows the scale of what we're talking about. Between 2001 and 2021, over 7,000 U.S. service members lost their lives in post 9/11 wars. But what many people don't know is that over 8,000 contractors died too.
I had no idea the numbers were that high.
And that's not even counting civilian casualties. The estimates are staggering. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their lives across Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones.
It's heartbreaking to think about the human cost of all this.
It is. And there's another aspect that often gets overlooked, the psychological impact. We spent billions on sophisticated weapon systems, but relatively little on understanding the social and cultural dynamics that drive extremism.
So we were treating the symptoms rather than the cause?
In many ways, yes. And this leads to something really crucial. While we were spending all this money on military solutions, new groups were emerging that operated in completely different ways.
Like using social media for recruitment?
Exactly. These groups adapted faster than our expensive counterterrorism infrastructure could keep up with. They learned to use encrypted communications, cryptocurrency, and social media in ways that traditional military responses just weren't equipped to handle.
So despite spending $6.4 trillion,
We might have actually made the problem more complex. The number of terrorist organizations worldwide has actually increased since 2001. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
that's actually pretty terrifying when you think about it.
And what's even more concerning is that many of the conditions that led to this poverty, political instability, lack of education, they're still there. In some cases, they're worse than before.
So after all that money spent, all those lives lost, we might be less safe than we were before?
That's the troubling question many experts are asking. But there's another layer to this story that takes us right up to the present day, and it involves some surprising new developments in how these conflicts are evolving. You know, while we're talking about how these conflicts evolved, there's something fascinating that happened around 2014. We saw the emergence of something completely different, a group that wanted to be more than just a terrorist organization.
ISIS, right? They actually tried to create their own state.
Exactly. And what made them unique was their approach. They weren't just fighting, they were setting up administrative systems, collecting taxes, even trying to provide basic services in the areas they controlled.
Wait, so they were actually trying to run things like a real government?
Yes, and here's what's really interesting. They were doing it with people who had actual government experience. Remember those former Iraqi military and government officials we mentioned? Many of them became part of ISIS's administrative structure.
So they had people who actually knew how to run things?
Precisely, but they also did something nobody had seen before. They created this sophisticated media operation. We're not just talking about grainy videos filmed in caves. These were professionally produced propaganda films, online magazines, even social media campaigns.
I remember hearing about them using Twitter and other platforms. It was pretty scary how effective they were at recruiting.
And that's what made them so different from groups like Al-Qaeda. They understood how to speak to a younger digital native audience. They were creating memes, using hashtags, even making their own apps.
Their own apps, that's actually terrifying.
It was. And here's something that really shows how different their approach was. At their peak, they were bringing in about $2 million per day through oil sales, taxation, and other revenue streams.
$2 million a day? That's more like a corporation than a terrorist group.
Exactly. They were essentially running a hybrid organization, part terrorist group, part proto-state, part media company. And they understood something crucial about the modern world, the power of spectacle.
What do you mean by spectacle?
Well, they knew that in the social media age, shocking content gets attention. They deliberately created horrific videos because they knew Western media would share them, amplifying their message and their reach.
So they were basically exploiting our own media systems against us?
Precisely. And they did something else that was really clever. They created this narrative of inevitable victory. They made it seem like joining them meant being part of something historic, something bigger than yourself.
That must have been really appealing to people feeling lost or disconnected.
Especially young people. And here's what's fascinating. While we were spending billions on traditional military responses, they were spending relatively little to reach potential recruits directly through their phones.
So they were fighting a 21st century war while we were still using 20th century tactics?
In many ways, yes. And even after their physical caliphate was defeated, their digital caliphate lived on. They showed future groups that you don't need massive territory or huge armies to have an impact.
You just need a good internet connection and some social media savvy.
And that's what makes the current situation so complex. These groups have learned to operate in ways that traditional military power just can't effectively counter. They're like a virus that keeps mutating to resist whatever we throw at it.
So what's the solution? I mean, we can't just shut down the internet.
That's the trillion-dollar question. And it's leading to some fascinating new approaches in counterterrorism. But that's actually a whole other chapter of this story. Speaking of new approaches, there's something fascinating happening right now in 2025. The battleground has shifted dramatically from physical territory to what experts are calling the digital caliphate.
That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. What exactly is a digital caliphate?
Imagine an entire extremist ecosystem that exists purely online. We're talking about virtual training camps, cryptocurrency fundraising, encrypted messaging networks, and even augmented reality propaganda.
Wait, augmented reality? They're using that now?
Yes, and it's pretty sophisticated. Some groups have created AR apps that overlay their messaging onto real-world locations. They're even using gaming elements to attract younger recruits.
That's terrifying, but also kind of genius from a technical standpoint.
And here's what's really interesting. They're using artificial intelligence to create personalized recruitment content. The algorithms analyze a potential recruit's social media presence and tailor the messaging specifically to their interests and vulnerabilities.
So it's like those targeted ads we all get, but for extremist content?
Exactly. But there's another layer that's even more concerning. These groups are now using deepfake technology to create convincing propaganda videos. They can make it appear as if their leaders are delivering live speeches from anywhere in the world.
Hmm. That must make it really hard for intelligence agencies to track what's real and what's not.
It does, and they're using blockchain technology in fascinating ways too. Some groups have created their own cryptocurrencies, making it nearly impossible to track or freeze their funds.
So they've basically created their own financial system?
Yes, and it gets even more interesting. They're using decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, to coordinate their activities. No central leadership to target, no headquarters to bomb.
That sounds like they're running their operations more like a tech startup than a terrorist group.
In many ways, they are. They even have what you might call digital recruiting officers who work full-time identifying and grooming potential recruits through online gaming platforms and social media.
So while we're looking for training camps in remote mountains,
The real training is happening in virtual reality spaces and encrypted chat rooms. They've created what counterterrorism experts call dark social networks. Completely private, invitation-only platforms that operate outside traditional social media.
how do you even fight something like that?
That's the challenge security agencies are grappling with. Traditional surveillance methods just don't work in this new landscape. And here's something that really shows how sophisticated this has become. Some groups are using machine learning to automatically generate propaganda content in dozens of languages.
So they can reach pretty much anyone, anywhere, in their native language?
Exactly. And they're using sentiment analysis tools to test which messages resonate best in different cultures and communities. It's like they're running a global marketing campaign.
This is starting to sound less like counterterrorism and more like cyber warfare.
That's because it is. The line between cybercrime, terrorism, and information warfare is becoming increasingly blurred. These groups are even running their own coding boot camps to train new cyber operatives
You mean they're teaching people how to hack?
and develop apps, create encryption tools, manage cryptocurrency operations. They're building a whole generation of cyber jihadists, but here's what's really fascinating. They're doing all this while spending far less than what governments spend on counterterrorism.
It's like they've found a way to punch way above their weight class.
And they're constantly evolving. Every time intelligence agencies develop new countermeasures, these groups adapt and find new ways to operate. It's like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands.
So what you're saying is the war on terror has basically moved online?
Not just moved online, it's transformed into something entirely new, and that transformation is forcing us to completely rethink how we approach counterterrorism in the 21st century. You know, Alex, looking back at everything we've covered today, what really strikes me is this cycle of unintended consequences. A $20 billion operation to fight the Soviets helped create the very threats we're fighting today.
It's incredible when you think about it. We went from arming fighters in Afghanistan to spending $6.4 trillion fighting the networks that emerged from those same groups.
And now we're seeing something completely new. These digital caliphates that operate more like tech companies than traditional terrorist organizations. They're using the same tools we all use: social media, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence.
It really makes you wonder what the next evolution will be. I mean, if we've gone from physical training camps to virtual reality recruitment in just a few decades,
That's exactly what keeps counterterrorism experts up at night. Every solution seems to create new problems, and these groups are incredibly adaptable. They're usually one step ahead of our responses.
so what's the answer? I mean, we can't just keep throwing money at military solutions if they're not working.
I think that's the key insight from all of this. We need to start thinking differently about security challenges. Maybe the answer isn't just about better weapons or surveillance, but understanding why these messages resonate with people in the first place.
Like treating the cause rather than just the symptoms?
Exactly. Because if there's one thing this history shows us, it's that today's solutions often become tomorrow's problems. The real challenge isn't just fighting current threats, it's making sure we're not accidentally creating the next ones.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.